So what does this have to do with God? What does it have to do with God? Well, what it ties into, where it relates, is basically how do we get to mental properties and mental substances? Why think that these would come about? And a Canadian philosopher really kind of highlights the problem. And it has to do with the grand story. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, well, atheism doesn't have any commitments or any worldview. Well, maybe, but there certainly are implications, at least that there's no God that creates things, would be an implication of naturalism. And so the way that a materialist, Canadian philosopher, Paul Churchland, he puts it this way. He says, the important point about the standard evolutionary story is that the human species and all of its features are the wholly physical outcome of a purely physical process. If this is the correct account of our origins, then there seems neither need nor room to fit any non-physical substances or properties into our theoretical account of ourselves. We are creatures of matter, and we should learn to live with that fact. And so what he's saying is like, look, it follows from materialism, and it follows from, from that worldview that there's no room to put in, a mental substance. I've heard another commentator say that essentially naturalism and evolution is a seamless garment without any room to insert a soul from above. And so there's just, it's unclear how you would get to mental properties and mental substances. It's certainly unexpected. Another person, put the slide up, this next quote, another person, Gottfried Leibniz. Now, he was a Christian, but he put it this way. This is a little bit archaic language, but he said, perception and that which depends on it are inexplicable by mechanical cause, that is, by figures and motions. And supposing there were a machine so constructed as to think, feel, and have perception, we could conceive of it as enlarged and yet preserving the same proportions, so that we might enter it as a mill. And this granted, we should only find on visiting it pieces which push one against another, but never anything by which to explain a perception. So what he's saying is essentially, if you've got a machine where it's just all physical parts that are pushing and pulling on each other, then you might get some interesting interactions between the pushing parts. But it's unclear, no matter how complicated the machine gets, that there would ever be perception, that there would ever be something that rises above those parts. And obviously we can't blow up our brains like a mill, like a windmill or something, and walk into it. But nonetheless, with modern technology, we can kind of get into it by looking through microscopes and things. And so we kind of do go into our brain as a mill. And if all that there is to us is the physical, then it's unclear how we can get to perception or those sorts of things. And so tying this back, how do we get to God? Well, this will be slide 13. Go ahead and post that. So what I want to do is look at just property dualism. So let's set substance dualism aside. Hopefully I've given you at least some reasons to think that at least property dualism is true. So why think that if property dualism is true, why think that God exists? Well, one of the first things to recognize about mere property dualism is that brain events cause mental events, but mental events don't cause brain events. Because the brain events, they follow the laws of physics and chemistry. It's all deterministic. So the causation is one way. Brain events cause mental events. Now, going back to the evolutionary story, that means that the content of our mental events has no bearing on reproduction or survival, because mental events don't cause physical. So they don't cause you to run away. They don't cause you to reproduce with viable or fertile people or anything like that, because mental events don't cause brain events. That's what's implied by property dualism. And so with that, there just doesn't seem to be any reason to think that we would have coherent mental events. So Dr. Bogardus puts it this way. He says that even if you could somehow have mental properties, like why would you have a coherent, flourishing mental life? So there's just a lot of different ways that you could have mental events without them being coherent. But there seems to be like only one way for it to be, or a very limited number of ways for them to be correct and veridical. So the example he gives is if you prick your finger with a pin, it could cause pain, and that's the veridical. But there's like a whole host of other things it could do that have nothing to do with the real world. It could cause you to have the taste of banana, or it could cause you to just see a uniform visual field of red. or it could cause you to, hear seagulls or something like that. Like, there's just a lot of different ways your mental events could be, but only like one way that it could be veridical, or a very narrow number of ways that it could be veridical. And so, without there being an evolutionary advantage, it's weird that we would have these, psychophysical laws that govern how the mind interacts with the body, and how it results in this epistemic flourishing that we have. So not only is there like this weird, like why would there be mental properties, like Leibniz and like Churchland said, like it just doesn't seem to be any room for that to come into the picture. It's wholly unexpected given atheism. But given theism, if God exists, well, number one, God entails mental properties because God's a mental substance, so he thinks about things, and he has mental properties. So it straight up entails that mental properties exist. The only question then would be, would there be physical properties if God exists? And then a coherent mental life. It wouldn't be surprising if God created conscious embodied agents that he would want us to have a coherent mental life, perhaps so we could interact with him. I'm not saying it'd be expected that God would create conscious embodied coherent life, but it certainly wouldn't be surprising. And so what we can do is we can look at Bayes' theorem, which I won't go into the full details here, but if you look on The Analytic Christian, Dr. Bogardus gives a really good analogy. He uses dice and different things to kind of explain how Bayes' theorem works. So I won't go into the details here, but there are essentially three critical variables that we plug into Bayes' theorem, and then we get a result out of it. So the variables are PRH, which is the probability of the hypothesis, PRE given H, which is probability of the evidence given the hypothesis. So if the hypothesis is true, how likely is it that we have this evidence? Probability of E given not the hypothesis. So if the hypothesis is false, how likely would we have this evidence? And then you plug all that into Bayes' theorem, and what comes out the other end is what's the posterior probability, or the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence. So you've got your starting probability of the hypothesis, and then you've got your ending probability of the hypothesis given the evidence. And what we'll find is, let's say that you're a hardcore atheist, and you think, before thinking about this argument or thinking about consciousness, you think, well, the probability that God exists is, we'll give it 3%. Almost certainly God doesn't exist, 3%. Well, what's the probability that we would have the evidence, which we'll say is physical properties, mental properties, and a coherent mental life? What's the probability of that given theism? It's hard to say one way or another. You could kind of have reasons one way, or you could have reasons the other. Maybe God would want beings that he could, interact with and have, a relationship with. He also, reproduction seems like it would need physical, and so he might create physical properties. But you could think other ways. So I think conservatively, we could give it 50%. Bogardus gave it 60%, which he took to be conservative. I think we can be even more conservative and just give it 50-50. Like, we know that there would be mental properties. Would there be physical? Would there be a coherent mental life? Maybe. And then what's the probability of the evidence given that the hypothesis is false, given atheistic naturalism? Well, then it's very surprising. Not only is it surprising that there are physical properties at all, we can set that aside, but it's very surprising that there'd be mental properties. Like, how would that come into the mix? And then that these mental properties would operate according to these psychophysical laws to give us this coherent mental life would be very surprising. And so I think 1% actually is conservative for that. I mean, is not something you would expect at all. And don't get too hung up on what the absolute values of the 50 and the 1 are. The formula actually gives the same result whether it's 50 and 1 or 5 and 0.1 or 0.5 and 0.01. It's not the absolute values of these, but their relationship to each other, like their relative values. And so basically what I'm saying by plugging these values in is, it seems to me like it's not that surprising. It's much less unlikely, if God exists, that these things would occur than if there's no God and we live in an atheistic, naturalistic universe. And so I think that's very reasonable. Well, if that's the case, then what we come out with on the other end is the probability of the hypothesis that God exists, given that evidence. What Bayes' theorem tells us is that it's 60.73% is what that works out to. Now, obviously it's a formula, but it just shows like how much it should move your credence. So that seems like pretty good evidence. If it can go from 3% to, God almost certainly doesn't exist, to, it's more likely that God exists than not, then I'd say that's pretty good evidence. But let's say that you're not convinced. Let's say that you listen to all this, you listen to the arguments, listen to the evidence, and you think about it. So not like you have to be, have a full thought through position right now, but let's say you think about it, and at the end of the day, what your position is you say, listen, I hear what you're saying, but this just doesn't seem to move the needle for me. It seems to me that it's just no more likely that God exists. I'm not saying I can point out flaws in the argument. I'm just saying that I'm not persuaded. So you'll agree that one is, it's more likely given theism than not. Sure, you don't have any problems with the arguments, but it just doesn't move the needle. You don't find yourself any more, you don't find it any more credible that God exists. Well, what would that be? Well, that's actually result 2. What value would it be for the probability of the hypothesis in order to have the same probability of the hypothesis given the evidence if there's a difference between the evidence given the hypothesis or not the hypothesis? If it's more likely given the hypothesis than if the hypothesis were false, then how do you end up with the same value? Well, there's really only one way you can do that and remain skeptical, and that's if the prior probability of the hypothesis is 0. And so that's a result as well. But what I think that is an implication of that is that, I've given you, 50 to 1, but if the prior probability is actually 0, then it doesn't really matter if it's 50 to 1, 50 million to 1, 50 trillion to 1. It doesn't actually matter. No matter what the relative values are, the posterior probability remains 0. And so that position would actually indicate that you might be just unresponsive to evidence. And so that's a result too. Again, I'm not saying everybody in the audience or anybody listening is that way, but it's worth thinking about that if you agree with what I'm saying in the sense that there are these mental properties and there's a soul, and it seems like a lot more likely if God exists, but it doesn't move the needle at all, then that's something to think about. And just think, are you being closed-minded or are you intransigent, or what exactly is going on? Why is it that evidence wouldn't move the needle? Thank you for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also look at the show notes in order to find a link to our group so that you can join our next discussion. I look forward to chatting with you.